Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a minute of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify my time thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means to help me out to keep it going, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're interested. Once again, that is patreon.com/sleepytimetales, or the link in the show notes. But if monthly is a big ask, and I can completely understand that it is, you can make once-off contributions to the tip jar on the website. And if you would like to help support Sleepy Time Tales without having to give me any money for it, you can simply spread the word. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep and you think I might be able to help them, just tell them about Sleepy Time Tales and where to find it. Thanks for your time there. Let's rejoin Charles Darwin. This week, we continue with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And we pick up today going over the actual mechanism of natural selection. Let us now turn to the nectar-feeding insects in our imaginary case. We may suppose the plant of which we have been slowly increasing the nectar by continued selection to be a common plant, and that certain insects depended in main part on its nectar for food. I could give many facts showing how anxious bees are to save time. For instance, the habit of cutting holes and sucking the nectar at the bases of certain flowers, which they can, with a very little more trouble, enter by the mouth. Bearing such facts in mind, I can see no reason to doubt that an accidental deviation in the size and form of the body, or in the curvature and length of the proboscis, far too slight to be appreciated by us, might profit a bee or other insect, so that an individual so characterized would be able to obtain its food more quickly, and so have a better chance of living and leaving descendants. Its descendants would probably inherit a tendency to a similar slight deviation of structure. The tubes of the corollas of the common red and incarnate clovers, Trifolium pratense and incarnatum, do not on a hasty glance appear to differ in length. Yet the hive bee can easily suck the nectar out of the incarnate clover, but not out of the common red clover, which is visited by humblebees alone. So that whole fields of the red clover offer in vain an abundant supply of precious nectar to the hive bee. Thus it might be a great advantage to the hive bee to have a slightly longer or differently constructed proboscis. On the other hand, I have found by experiment that the fertility of clover greatly depends on bees visiting and moving parts of the corolla so as to push the pollen onto the stigmatic surface. Hence, again, if humble bees were to become rare in any country, it might be a great advantage to the red clover to have a shorter or more deeply divided tube to its corolla, so that the hive bee could visit its flowers. Thus I can understand how a flower and a bee might slowly become, either simultaneously or one after the other, modified and adapted in the most perfect manner to each other, by the continued preservation of individuals presenting mutual and slightly favorable deviations of structure. I am well aware that this doctrine of natural selection, exemplified in the above imaginary instances, is open to the same objections which were at first urged against Sir Charles Lyell's noble views on the modern changes of the earth as illustrative of geology. But we now very seldom hear the action, for instance, of the coast waves, called a trifling and insignificant cause, when applied to the excavation of gigantic valleys or to the formation of the longest lines of inland cliffs. Natural selection can only by the preservation and accumulation of infinitesimally small inherited modifications, each profitable to the preserved being, and as modern geology has almost banished such views as the excavation of a great valley by a single diluvial wave, so will natural selection, if it be a true principle, banish the belief of the continued creation of new organic beings, or of any great and sudden modification in their structure. On the intercrossing of individuals, I must here introduce a short digression. In the case of animals and plants with separated sexes, it is of course obvious that two individuals must always unite for each birth. But in the case of hermaphrodites, it is far from obvious. Nevertheless, I am strongly inclined to believe that with all hermaphrodites, two individuals, either occasionally or habitually, concur for the reproduction of their kind. This view, I may add, was first suggested by Andrew Knight. We shall presently see its importance, but I must here treat the subject with extreme brevity, though I have the materials prepared for an ample discussion. All vertebrate animals, all insects, and some other large groups of animals pair for each birth. Modern research has much diminished the number of supposed hermaphrodites, and of real hermaphrodites, a large number pair. That is, two individuals regularly unite for reproduction, which is all that concerns us. But still there are many hermaphrodite animals which certainly do not habitually pair, and a vast majority of plants are hermaphrodites. What reason, it may be asked, is there for supposing in these cases that two individuals ever occur in reproduction? As it is impossible here to enter on details, I must trust to some general considerations alone. In the first place, I have collected so large a body of facts, showing, in accordance with the almost universal belief of breeders, that with animals and plants a cross between different varieties, or between individuals of the same variety but of another strain, gives vigor and fertility to the offspring. And on the other hand, that close interbreeding diminishes vigor and fertility. That these facts alone incline me to believe that it is a general law of nature, utterly ignorant though we may be of the meaning of the law, that no organic being self-fertilizes itself for an eternity of generations, but that a cross with another individual is occasionally, perhaps at very long intervals, indispensable. On the belief that this is a law of nature, we can, I think, understand several large classes of facts, such as the following, which on any other view are inexplicable. Every hybridizer knows how unfavorable exposure to wet is to the fertilization of a flower. Yet what a multitude of flowers have their antlers and stigmas fully exposed to the weather. But if an occasional cross be indispensable, the fullest freedom for the entrance of pollen from another individual will explain the state of exposure. More especially as the plant's own antlers and pistil generally stand so close together that self-fertilization seems almost inevitable. Many flowers, on the other hand, have their organs of fructification closely enclosed, as in the great Papilionaceous or pea family. But in several, perhaps all such flowers, there is a very curious adaptation between the structure of the flower and the manner in which bees suck the nectar. For in doing this, they either push the flower's own pollen on the stigma, or bring pollen from another flower. So necessary are the visits of bees to papilionaceous flowers that I have found by experiments published elsewhere that their fertility is greatly diminished if these visits be prevented. Now, it is scarcely possible that bees should fly from flower to flower and not carry pollen from one to the other to the greater good, as I believe, of the plant. Bees will act like a camel hair pencil, and it is quite sufficient just to touch the antlers of one flower and then the stigma of another with the same brush to ensure fertilization. But it must not be supposed that bees would thus produce a multitude of hybrids between distinct species. For if you bring on the same brush of plant's own pollen and pollen from another species, the former will have such a prepotent effect that it will invariably and completely destroy, as has been shown by Gartner, any influence from the foreign pollen. When the stamens of a flower suddenly spring towards the pistil, or slowly move one after the other towards it, the contrivance seems adapted solely to ensure self-fertilization, and no doubt it is useful for this end. But the agency of insects is often required to cause the stamens to spring forward, as Coleridge has shown to be the case with the barberry. And curiously, in this very genus, which seems to have a special contrivance for self-fertilization, it is well known that if very closely allied forms or varieties are planted near each other, it is hardly possible to raise pure seedlings. So largely do they naturally cross. In many other cases, far from there being any aids for self-fertilization, there are special contrivances, as I could show from the writings of C.C. Sprengel and from my own observations, which effectively prevent the stigma receiving pollen from its own flower. For instance, in Lobelia fulgens, there is a really beautiful and elaborate contrivance by which every one of the infinitely numerous pollen granules are swept out of the conjoined antlers of each flower, before the stigma of that individual flower is ready to receive them. And as this flower is never visited, at least in my garden, by insects, it never sets a seed, though by placing a pollen from one flower on the stigma of another, I raised plenty of seedlings. And whilst another species of lobelia growing close by, which is visited by bees, seeds freely. In very many other cases, though there be no special mechanical contrivance to prevent the stigma of a flower receiving its own pollen, yet as C.C. Sprengel has shown, and I can confirm, either the antlers burst before the stigma is ready for fertilization, or the stigma is ready before the pollen of that flower is ready, so that these plants have, in fact, separated sexes, and must habitually be crossed. How strange are these facts! How strange that the pollen and stigmatic surface of the same flower, that place so close together, as if for the very purpose of self-fertilization, should in so many cases be mutually useless to each other. How simply are these facts explained on the view of an occasional cross, of the distinct individual being advantageous or indispensable. If several varieties of the cabbage, radish, onion, and of some other plants be allowed to seed near each other, a large majority, as I have found, of the seedlings thus raised will turn out mongrels. For instance, I raised 233 seedling cabbages from some plants of different varieties growing near each other, and of these only 78 were true to their kind, and some even of these were not perfectly true. Yet the pistil of each cabbage flower is surrounded not only by its own 6 stamens, but by those of the many other flowers on the same plant. How then comes it that such a vast number of the seedlings are mongrelized? I suspect that it must arise from the pollen of a distinct variety, having a prepotent effect over a flower's own pollen, and that this is general of the law of good being derived from the intercrossing of distinct individuals of the same species. When distinct species are crossed, the case is directly the reverse, for a plant's own pollen is always prepotent over foreign pollen. But to this subject we shall return in a future chapter. In the case of a gigantic tree covered with innumerable flowers, it may be objected that pollen could seldom be carried from tree to tree, and at most only from flower to flower on the same tree, and that flowers on the same tree can be considered as distinct individuals only in a limited sense. I believe this objection to be valid, but that nature has largely provided against it, by giving to trees a strong tendency to bear flowers with separated sexes. When the sexes are separated, although the male and female flowers may be produced on the same tree, we can see that pollen must be regularly carried from flower to flower, and this will give a better chance of pollen being occasionally carried from tree to tree. That trees belonging to all orders have their sexes more often separated than other plants, I find to be the case in this country, and at my request Dr. Hooker tabulated the trees of New Zealand, and Dr. Asa Gray those of the United States, and the result was as I anticipated. On the other hand, Dr. Hooker has recently informed me that he finds that the rule does not hold in Australia, and I have made these few remarks on the sexes of trees, simply to call attention to the subject. Turning for a very brief space to animals. On the land there are some hermaphrodites, as land mollusca and earthworms, but these all pair. As yet I have not found a single case of a terrestrial animal which fertilizes itself. We can understand this remarkable fact, which offers so strong a contrast with terrestrial plants, on the view of an occasional cross being indispensable, by considering the medium in which terrestrial animals live, and the nature of the fertilizing element. For we know of no means, analogous to the action of insects and of wind in the case of plants, by which an occasional cross could be effected with terrestrial animals without the occurrence of 2 individuals. Of aquatic animals, there are many self-fertilizing hermaphrodites, but here currents in the water offer an obvious means for an occasional cross. And as in the case of flowers, I have as yet failed, after consultation with one of the highest authorities, namely Professor Huxley, to discover a single case of a hermaphrodite animal with the organs of reproduction so perfectly enclosed within the body that access from without and the occasional influence of a distinct individual can be shown to be physically impossible. Cirripedes long appeared to me to present a case of very great difficulty under this point of view, but I have been able, by fortunate chance elsewhere, to prove that 2 individuals, though both are self-fertilizing hermaphrodites, do sometimes cross. It must have struck most naturalists as a strange anomaly that in the case of both animals and plants, species of the same family and even of the same genus, though agreeing closely with each other in almost their whole organization, yet are not really, some of them hermaphrodites, and some of them are unisexual. But if, in fact, all hermaphrodites do occasionally intercross with other species, the difference between hermaphrodites and unisexual species, as far as function is concerned, becomes very small. From these several considerations and from the many special facts which I have collected, but which I am not here able to give, I am strongly inclined to suspect that both in the vegetable and animal kingdoms, an occasional intercross with a distinct individual is a law of nature. I am well aware that there are, on this view, many cases of difficulty, some of which I am trying to investigate. Finally, then, we may conclude that in many organic beings, a cross between two individuals is an obvious necessity for each birth. In many others, it occurs perhaps only at long intervals. But in none, as I suspect, can self-fertilization go on for perpetuity. The circumstances favorable to natural selection. This is an extremely intricate subject. A large amount of inheritable and diversified variability is favorable, but I believe mere individual differences suffice for the work. A large number of individuals, by giving a better chance for the appearance within any given period of profitable variations, will compensate for a lesser amount of variability in each individual, and is, I believe, an extremely important element of success. Though nature grants vast periods of time for the work of natural selection, she does not grant an indefinite period. For as all organic beings are striving, it may be said, to seize on each place in the economy of nature, if any one species does not become modified and improved in a corresponding degree with its competitors, it will soon be exterminated. In man's methodical selection, a breeder selects for some definite object, and free intercrossing will wholly stop his work. But when many men, without intending to alter the breed, have a nearly common standard of perfection, and all try to get and breed from the best animals, much improvement and modification surely but slowly follow from this unconscious process of selection, notwithstanding a large amount of crossing with inferior animals. Thus it will be in nature, for within a confined area, with some place in its polity not so perfectly occupied as might be, natural selection will always tend to preserve all the individuals, varying in the right direction, though in different degrees, so as better to fill up the unoccupied space. But if the area be large, its several districts will almost certainly present different conditions of life. And then if natural selection be modifying and improving a species in the several districts, there will be intercrossing with the other individuals of the same species on the confines of each. And in this case, the effects of intercrossing can hardly be counterbalanced by natural selection always tending to modify all the individuals in each district in exactly the same manner to the conditions of each. For in a continuous area, the conditions will generally graduate away insensibly from one district to another. The intercrossing will most affect those animals which unite for each birth, which wander much and which do not breed at a very quick rate. Hence, in animals of this nature, for instance in birds, varieties will generally be confined to separated countries, and this I believe to be the case. In hermaphrodite organisms which cross only occasionally, and likewise in animals which unite for each birth, but which wander little, and which can increase at a very rapid rate, a new and improved variety might be quickly formed on any one spot, and might there maintain itself in a body, so that whatever intercrossing took place would be chiefly between the individuals of the same new variety. A local variety, when once thus formed, might subsequently slowly spread to other districts, On the above principle, nurserymen always prefer getting seed from a large body of plants of the same variety, as the chance of intercrossing with other varieties is thus lessened. Even in the case of slow-breeding animals which unite for each birth, we must not overrate the effects of intercrosses in retarding natural selection. For I can bring a considerable catalogue of facts, showing that within the same area, varieties of the same animal can long remain distinct, from haunting different stations, from breeding at slightly different seasons, or from varieties of the same kind preferring to pair together. Intercrossing plays a very important part in nature in keeping the individuals of the same species, or of the same variety, true and uniform in character. It will obviously thus act far more efficiently with those animals which unite for each birth, but I have already attempted to show that we have reason to believe that occasional intercrosses take place with all animals, and with all plants. Even if these take place only at long intervals, I am convinced that the young thus produced will gain so much in vigor and fertility over the offspring from long continued self-fertilization that they will have a better chance of surviving and propagating their kind. And thus, in the long run, the influence of intercrosses, even at rare intervals, will be great. If there exist organic beings which never intercross, uniformity of character can be retained amongst them, as long as their conditions of life remain the same. Only through the principle of inheritance and through natural selection, destroying any which depart from the proper type. But if their conditions of life change and they undergo modification, uniformity of character can be given to their modified offspring, solely by natural selection, preserving the same favorable variations. Isolation also is an important element in the process of natural selection. In a confined or isolated area, if not very large, the organic and inorganic conditions of life will generally be in a great degree uniform, so that natural selection will tend to modify all the individuals of a varying species throughout the area in the same manner in relation to the same conditions. Intercrosses also with the individuals of the same species, which otherwise would have inhabited the surrounding and differently circumstanced districts, will be prevented. But isolation probably acts more efficiently in checking the immigration of better or adapted organisms after any physical change, such as of climate or elevation of the land, etc. And thus new places in the natural economy of the country are left open for the old inhabitants to struggle for and become adapted to, through modification in their structure and constitution. Lastly, isolation, by checking immigration and consequently competition, will give time for any new variety to be slowly improved, and this may sometimes be of importance in the production of new species. If, however, an isolated area be very small, either from being surrounded by barriers or from having very peculiar physical conditions, the total number of the individuals supported on it will necessarily be very small, and fewness of individuals will greatly retard the production of new species through natural selection, by decreasing the chance of the appearance of favorable variations. If we turn to nature to test the truth of these remarks, and look at any small isolated area, such as an oceanic island, although the small number of the species inhabiting it will be found to be small, as we shall see in our chapter on geographical distribution, yet of these species a very large proportion are endemic, that is, having been produced there and nowhere else. Hence an oceanic island at first sight seems to have been highly favorable for the production of new species. But we may thus greatly deceive ourselves, for to ascertain whether a small, isolated area, or a large open area like a continent, has been most favorable for the production of new organic forms, we ought to make the comparison within equal times, and this we are incapable of doing. Although I do not doubt that isolation is of considerable importance in the production of new species, on the whole I am inclined to believe that largeness of area is of more importance, more especially in the production of species which will prove capable of enduring for a long period and of spreading widely. Throughout a great and open area, not only will there be a better chance of favorable variations arriving from the large number of individuals of the same species there supported, but the conditions of life are infinitely complex from the large number of already existing species. And if some of these many species become modified and improved, others will have to be improved in a corresponding degree, or they will be exterminated. Each new form also, as soon as it has been much improved, will be able to spread over the open and continuous area, and will thus come into competition with many others. Hence more new places will be formed, and the competition to fill them will be more severe on large than on a small and isolated area. Moreover, great areas, though now continuous, owing to oscillations of level, will often have recently existed in a broken condition, so that the good effects of isolation will generally, to a certain effect, have concurred. Finally, I'll conclude that although small isolated areas probably have been in some respects highly favorable for the production of new species, yet that the course of modification will generally have been more rapid on large areas, and what is more important, that the new forms produced on large areas, which already have been victorious over many competitors, will be those that will spread most widely, will give rise to most new varieties and species, and will thus play an important part in the changing history of the organic world. We can perhaps on these views understand some facts which will be alluded to in our chapter on geographical distribution. For instance, that the productions of the smaller continent of Australia have formerly yielded, and apparently are now yielding, before those of the larger European-Asiatic area. Thus also it is that continental productions have everywhere become so largely nationalized on islands. On a small island, the race for life will have been less severe, and there will have been less modification and less extermination. Hence perhaps it comes that the flora of Madeira, according to Oswald here, resembles the extinct tertiary flora of Europe. All freshwater basins taken together make a small area compared with that of the sea or of the land, and consequently the competition between freshwater productions will have been less severe than elsewhere. New forms will have been more slowly formed, and old forms more slowly exterminated. And it is in freshwater that we find 7 genera of ganoid fishes, remnants of a once preponderant order, and in freshwater we find some of the most anomalous forms now known in the world, as the ornithorhynchus and lepidosiren, which like fossils connect to a certain extant orders now widely separated in the natural scale. These anomalous forms may almost be called living fossils. They have endured to the present day from having inhabited a confined area and from having thus been exposed to less severe competition. To sum up the circumstances favorable and unfavorable to natural selection, as far as the extreme intricacy of the subject permits, I conclude, looking to the future, that for terrestrial productions in a large continental area, which will probably undergo many oscillations of level, and which consequently will exist for long periods in a broken condition, will be the most favorable for the production of many new forms of life, likely to endure long and to spread widely. For the area will first have existed as a continent, and the inhabitants, at this period numerous in individuals and kinds, will have been subjected to very severe competition. When converted by subsistence into large separate islands, there will still exist many individuals of the same species on each island. Intercrossing on the confines of the range of each species will thus be checked. After physical changes of any kind, immigration will be prevented, so that new places in the polity of each island will have to be filled up by modifications of the old inhabitants, and time will be allowed for the varieties in each to become well modified and perfected. When by renewed elevation the islands shall be reconverted into a continental area, there will again be severe competition. The most favored or improved species will be enabled to spread, and there will be much extinction of the less improved forms. And the relative proportional numbers of the various inhabitants of the renewed continent will again be changed, and again there will be fair field for natural selection to improve still further the inhabitants, and thus produce new species. That natural selection will always act with extreme slowness, I fully admit. Its action depends on there being places in the polity of nature which can be better occupied by some of the inhabitants of the country undergoing modification of some kind. The existence of such places will often depend on physical changes, which are generally very slow, and on the immigration of better adapted forms having been checked. But the action of natural selection will probably still oftener depend on some of the inhabitants becoming slowly modified, the mutual relations of many of the other inhabitants being thus disturbed. Nothing can be affected unless favorable variations occur, and variation itself is apparently always a very slow process. The process will often be greatly retarded by free intercrossing. Many will exclaim that these several causes are amply sufficient, wholly, to stop the action of natural selection. I do not believe so. On the other hand, I do believe that natural selection will always act very slowly, often only at long intervals of time, and generally on only a very few of the inhabitants of the same region at the same time. I further believe that this very slow, intermittent action of natural selection accords perfectly well with what geology tells us of the rate and manner at which the inhabitants of the world have changed. Slow though the process of selection may be, if feeble man can do much by his powers of artificial selection, I can see no limit to the amount of change, to the beauty and infinite complexity of the co-adaptations between all organic beings, one with another, and with their physical conditions of life, which may be affected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection. And on that rather stirring note, I think I'm going to leave it for tonight. As always, if you want to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.